Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We're going to get started in just a moment. We are actually, the handout that we have today is a different handout from last week. So I hope you'll take a copy. It has some of the same material from last week, but it's mostly new material. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be concluding chapter 28 of the first section of Moreh Nevukhim. Once again, we are broadcasting from webyeshiva.org's Facebook page. The handout is available on the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. You can go there very easily and just download the JPEG file that is there. Also recommend that if you're watching remotely, you may want to join that Facebook group so that you can get notifications of when a new handout becomes available. We usually post the handouts on the day before the shir. I just want us to get our bearings first. The Rambam was communicating to us the definitions of the word foot and the definition of the word throne as it pertains to God. And the reason, the pasuk that he used to explain those terms is a very important pasuk which describes some kind of very profound and esoteric prophetic experience in Exodus chapter 24, that when the elders went up and ascended Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, at the time of receiving the Torah tells us in verse 10, Vayiru eit Elokei Yisrael. They saw the God of Israel, v'tachat raglav, and underneath his feet, or its feet, as Unkelus had translated it, kima'asei livnat Sapphire, it was like the act of sapphire brick, uche'etzem hashamayim latohar, and like the essence of the heavens in its purity. And the Rambam spent the first half of chapter 28 really explaining what it means to talk about God's foot and what does it mean to be underneath God's feet. The Rambam himself had explained that the idea is that God is the cause of something. God is the cause of this sapphire brickwork that these elders are having a vision of, and that's what the word foot means. He explained that Onkelus's project was to distance any corporeality from God, and as such, when he translated V'tachat raglav, he used two steps of distancing corporeality from God by saying that not only does the word underneath his feet not refer to God's feet, but it refers not only to God's Shekhinah, which is what they had a vision of. They didn't have a vision of God himself. They had a vision of some manifestation of God, some created manifestation, which we call the Shekhinah. And that Shekhinah was seated on a divine throne in their image. And the feet are the feet of the throne, just like every chair has legs. So it's under the legs of the throne is what this vision was, and it was a type of brickwork. The only thing that Onkelos does not translate is what does this brickwork, what is it supposed to signify? And the Rambam says that Onkelos is not to blame for not telling us, because after all, that's not his project. His project is not to explain every term that appears in the Torah that may be given to multiple interpretations. And Onkelos's project is to distance corporeality from God, but not necessarily to explain everything else. But then he goes on to say, and this is where we're up to in the guide, it is in the Pines edition, the bottom of page 60, as for us, it is certainly incumbent upon me, in accordance with the purpose of this treatise, to interpret something of this parable. I mean, after all, especially in the first section of Moreh Nevukhim, I'm talking about how we understand God and the divinity, any manifestation of the divine. So if this is a very fundamental prophetic experience where human beings are first encountering the divine for the first time ever in the Torah, it certainly behooves us to explain what is going on. And therefore he says as follows, I shall accordingly say that when it says under his feet, it intends to signify he being the cause and because of him, as we already explained. That v'tachat raglav means because of God. That's what the word regel means. We proved this last time, that the word regel means A is the cause of B. We say that A is the regel of B. That's what the word regel is, biglal, because of. So we can also say, I should really say that when I say the regel of B, B is the cause of A. It was really the more correct thing to say. That if I say regel A is at the regel of B, it means to say that B is the cause of A. So if I say that something is beneath God's feet, it means that God is the cause of that which is beneath his feet. And so what was the vision that they were having? Was in reality, what they apprehended was the true reality of first matter, or prime matter, it can be translated, which derives from him, may he be exalted, he being the cause of its existence. Now, let me just talk about prime matter and what this term means, because as we know, the Rambam is an Aristotelian, and the terms that he uses are terms that he has drawn from Aristotle and the students of Aristotle, who filter and really translate Aristotle's writings. The Rambam is not living in the time of Aristotle. Aristotle lives before the Common Era, and the Rambam is living 10 centuries, 11 centuries after the Common Era. So he receives the teachings of Aristotle through a lens of all who have come before him. I gave you a small paragraph from a website that I happened to find online, but I'm going to speak it out. But you at least have an encyclopedia entry there in your handout for you. What is prime matter? Aristotle believed, as did most Platonists and Neoplatonists, that there's got to be some system whereby a completely non-corporeal being, such as God, is able to emanate from itself and cause everything that which is physical in our world to come into existence. It cannot happen at the snap of a finger that there's a prime mover, that there's this divine being, and all of a sudden it snaps its fingers and causes things to come into existence which are completely different in their very essence and nature from that divine being. And so the conclusion must be is that there's some kind of intermediary type of emanation that comes from that divine being, which are the building blocks of all that exists today. Aristotle very much believed in the concept of this dichotomy that we've talked about before, form and matter. If you remember those two terms and how they relate to Aristotle, the whole world is comprised of form and matter, in that everything that is physical is comprised of the matter of, let's say, a chair may be made out of metal, so metal is the matter of the chair, and the form of the chair is the form that it takes to be a chair. That form originated in the mind of the artisan who builds the chair. He takes the raw material, the molten metal, and he shapes it using the form that is in his mind and transfers that form onto the metal to turn it into a chair. Or the carpenter takes the wood and does the same thing. Okay, but the point being is that all existent material substances that exist in our world are all comprised of form and matter. There are 4 prime elements in the world that can be manipulated into different forms: earth, wind, fire, and water. Those are the basic elements in Greek philosophy. But then Aristotle implies that there's something above that, which is called prime matter, which is completely formless matter. In other words, it hasn't even been formed or distributed into 4 different elements, but it's completely bare and divested of any kind of characteristic that would be attributed to any kind of form. And that's what prime matter is, completely ready to be imbued with form, but having no form in and of itself, just raw stuff, raw substance.
Is it the elements of the periodic table? Should he have come in a time machine?
No, it's the precursor. It's the precursor. The periodic table is way, way ahead in history. The four elements are the precursor to the periodic table, but even the precursor to the four elements is this prime matter, which is just waiting to be imbued with some type of elemental form. Being an element means that you have some form. Fire has form, it has the form of fire. Water has form, it has the form of water. But something even before that, is something that is so basic it has no substance and no form whatsoever, other than just being pure, formless matter. And that's the only way that we can describe it. That is the first emanation that comes from God, ready to be manipulated and to be formed by God into the basic elements. And from those elements, you create compound elements and all of the substances that exist in our world. Okay? That's the idea.
It's formless, but it has a physical...
It's formless, right, but form is non-physical. Form, by definition, is non-physical, and it is placed within the physical matter to give it form.
This is conceptual.
This is all conceptual.
It's highly conceptual.
This is highly conceptual, right. Okay? That's the way Aristotle viewed everything that exists in our world. Okay? That's the way that was his, and it takes some time to adjust one's mind from a modern conception of physics and science and to put oneself in that world. Okay, but that's the way that, now, some theorize, I just read something not too long ago, that this prime matter that Aristotle and now the Rambam are referring to is actually energy. It's the original energy, because Einstein's theory of relativity says that energy converts into matter. And so this sort of like raw energy, when it is harnessed, it turns into matter. I don't know whether that's compatible or not. I have no idea. But now that you have a basic framework conceptually of what prime matter is for the Rambam and for Aristotle, let's see how this relates to the way that he understands this vision that these elders have. He says these sapphire bricks are prime matter. Now before we go any further, I should, for thoroughness, tell you that there is a much more simple approach to what these sapphire bricks are, and I want to share this with you because it's really, truly meaningful. Why did these elders have a vision of sapphire bricks beneath God's throne? Rashi tells us very simply that the function of these bricks was to remind the Jewish leaders that the bricks that they had been building in Egypt, when they were in the mud and in the mortared pits, killing themselves, literally and figuratively, to be able to build these bricks and manufacture bricks for the Egyptian cities, were in God's eyes the most precious things that had been created by man. And that for every brick that they had made, there was a brick of pure sapphire that was in the heavens, right underneath his throne. And this is like a beautiful imagery of the idea that all the sacrifices that the Jewish people have made are underneath the divine throne. That's why we say that Yitzchak Avinu, after he is sacrificed, that the Akedah is beneath God's throne. Anything that is precious to God that involves human commitment and sacrifice, especially on behalf of the Jewish people, is considered to be beneath God's throne. Sharon. The tears are counted. All of these things, right, are very, very dear and precious to God. And it's also, not only are they beneath the divine throne, but that which looks so abject and so lowly from a human perspective, like a slave working in a mortar pit, building a lowly brick, for Hashem is lofty and exalted and incredible and priceless sapphire. Okay? So that's the midrashic interpretation that Rashi presents us with. There's a more elaborate medrash about this that's brought by Chizkuni, but we're not going to get into that right now. The Rambam says that this is a philosophical vision of prime matter that is the direct offspring or offshoot from Hashem, and this is how God brings the world into existence. And he continues and he says, consider its dictum. as it were a work of the whiteness of sapphire stone. If the intended signification had been the color, it would have said, as it were, the whiteness of sapphire stone. The word work was added. In other words, if you look carefully at the pasuk, it doesn't say they saw white sapphire stone. It says they saw the work that was kima'aseh, like the work of white sapphire stone. What that means is that the color white is not descriptive of the color of the stone, but rather, because matter, as you know, is always receptive and passive, and if one considers its essence, and is not active except by accident. What he means to say is that there's a certain transparency to this sapphire stone. That's what is meant by the word white, not the color white, but completely transparent. And what is something that is transparent? It is prepared to receive all color from anything that is imposed in front of it or behind it. It is completely ready as the receiver to receive color, to receive, and in that sense, the vision is prime matter is purely a recipient, ready to receive whatever is imbued into it. That's the implication of the handiwork of white. Ready to be worked upon, ready to be affected, and ready to be imbued with color and all other characteristics. Okay? And what he means to say when he says that matter is always passive and is only active by accident, what he means to say is that anytime you find something that contains matter to be active, it means it's only because it's combined with form. Just like anything else, as Kreskis, one of the commentaries to the Moreh Nevukhim, says, sometimes it will appear as if matter is active or acting upon something else, but only because form is mixed with it. So for example, fire is a composite of matter and form, as I mentioned, even though fire is elemental and is very basic, but it still has some form. It has the form of fire. And therefore, if you do detect some activity that fire is acting upon something else, as it does, it incinerates or burns something else, it's because of the form of fire, not because of the matter that exists within the fire. That's the basic idea that he's trying to communicate. Form, on the other hand, is in its essence always active, as has been made clear in the books on natural science, and is passive only by accident. The complete opposite is true by form. Form acts upon matter. If you ever see form being acted upon, like a human being is a composite of form and matter. If a human being is acted upon and not acting upon something else, it's only because the human being is partially comprised of matter. It is matter which always receives or is acted upon, and it is form which always acts upon and affects other things. And that's why Scripture applies to this prime matter, the expression, as it were a work. In other words, it's ready to be worked upon. As for the whiteness of sapphire stone, the expression is intended to signify transparency and not a white color. For the whiteness of a crystal is not due to a white color, but solely to its transparency. And as has been demonstrated in the books on natural science, transparency is not a color. For if it were a color, it would not let all the colors be seen behind it and would not receive all of them. But, so he says, this is the idea behind a transparent body. It receives all the colors in succession just because it lacks a color of its own. In this, it resembles this prime matter, which in respect of its true reality lacks all forms, and on this account is capable of receiving all forms in succession. Accordingly, their vision, what they were perceiving when they saw this vision, had as its object this prime matter and the relation of the latter to God, inasmuch as it is the first among the things he has created that necessitates generation and corruption, and God is its creator ex nihilo. That God created this prime matter from nothing, and therefore God was giving them an understanding of how he brought the world into existence. One might also argue that this prime matter is described by the Torah when it talks about, at the time of creation, tohu vavohu, that this was formless matter, chaos and void. It was on some level this primal type of creation, this very, very primitive type of matter that God had first formed, waiting for it to be constructed and assembled into constructs, because God would imbue everything with form. That's the way a philosopher would view the story of creation as described in Genesis. And he says a disquisition on this notion will come further. I'm going to explain this much later on. And then he says, I'm going to just paraphrase this for constraints of time. He says, I want you to know something, that even if you're going to go with Onkelus's translation that we mentioned last time, where underneath the feet refers to the legs of the throne of God, that underneath the legs of the throne was this sapphire brickwork, you also have to explain that where it says under the throne of his glory, I mean to say that the prime matter is also in reality under the heavens that is also called the throne. Meaning that Onkelos understands that there's this divine throne that they have a vision of in heaven, and underneath the legs of the throne is a reference to a spatial underneath. He says it's not that God is the cause of prime matter, but that actually this prime matter is underneath the Shekhinah in some way. Where does the Shekhinah reside? It resides in heaven. Where is prime matter? Prime matter is below the heavens. And the Rambam says, I'm going to explain this later on to you. If I do have time, I will read for you the Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer that the Rambam is referring to, which basically states that there are two types of prime matter that God created. He created a heavenly prime matter, and he created an earthly prime matter, because there's a belief in ancient philosophy that the essence, the substance that of ethereal beings that exist in the heavens is made up of a different type of matter than the earthly substances that has a different type of matter. So when it says that underneath God's feet is this sapphire brickwork, which is this prime matter, it means that in the earthly plane, not in the heavenly plane, but in the earthly plane, which is beneath the Shekhinah in heaven, there is this prime matter which is more earthy in its, or inferior, as the Rambam writes later on, in its makeup, and that's what comprises all substances which are on a physical plane in our planet. And he says a pointer to this marvelous interpretation was only given to me by a dictum in Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer, in the Medrash of Rebbe Eliezer ben Hyrcanus that I came across. You will see it in one of the chapters of this treatise when we get to section 2, chapter 26. That is when the Rambam will quote this Medrash, and I have it for you in the handout. I'm not sure if we'll have time to get to it today. Now, the purpose of everyone endowed with intellect should be wholly directed to rejecting corporeality with respect to God may be exalted, and to considering all these apprehensions as intellectual, not sensory, understand this and reflect upon it. And basically the Rambam's last statement is, remember, the reason why I'm not getting into detail about what this brickwork is any more than I have is because the main thrust of this chapter is to focus on distancing corporeality from God. And that I've done by carefully explaining to you that when it says tachat raglav, underneath his legs or feet, does not mean that God has legs, but the word regel means God is the cause of prime matter. Now, ad kan the Rambam. Let's talk. We need to go a little bit deeper for just a few minutes. The question, of course, is what is the purpose of this vision? In other words, God is introducing himself to the Jewish people at Har Sinai. He's giving them the Torah. All of a sudden, we are given this interlude in Exodus chapter 24 about the 70 elders who ascend to a certain point on the ascent of Mount Sinai, and they have this vision. The Rambam has given us this very, very esoteric, profound explanation as to what they're actually cognizing in this vision. But what's the point? What is the purpose of God giving them this particular vision at this particular juncture of his introducing himself to the Jewish people? What would possibly be the connection to what is going on in the narrative of the Torah, of Matan Torah, of the giving of the Torah?
Was this after the first or the second tablets?
It's a very good question. It seems, at least according to some commentaries, that it's after the giving of the first tablets. But it's really not clear from the context. Clearly, chronologically, you could make the argument that, I'm not sure if you can no. It has to be, it's after the first tablets. It's after the first tablets.
So
yeah.
it really didn't have an impact of helping them put off the Chet HaEgel? This big group of important...
Well, these were the 70 elders. Let's assume they weren't complicit in the Chet HaEgel. Let's assume they didn't participate. I mean, Aaron we know did, but not because he bought into the Egel, right? As many commentaries explain, he was trying to delay things and try to make concessions.
They were leaders.
These were leaders, so they were having this very lofty kind of vision. But so again, I just want to point out what is the function. On the simplest level, the function of this vision is for God to introduce himself as the creator of heaven and earth. In other words, if you're living in a primitive time and you're introduced to a deity and you don't know who this deity is, the way for God to introduce himself is, not only am I the giver of the law, but I am creator of heaven and earth. And therefore you can put the two together. And that's why whenever we acknowledge creation, we also acknowledge Yetziat Mitzrayim and vice versa. Every Shabbos when we make Kiddush, we say Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim and Zecher L'Ma'aseh V'Reshit, that this is a reminder of both experiences because one corroborates the other. Man was not present at the time of creation. He was not witness to creation. So the Exodus experience, which culminates in Matan Torah, sort of verifies the creation narrative for man who is now witness to the Exodus. But God has to point out to man, I am the same God who created heaven and earth. And there you can see this vision of Kemaseh Livnata Sapphire, the sapphire work, which is what the Tohu Vavohu that I created when I brought everything into existence. That's the simplest explanation, but I believe it goes much deeper. And it's based on the Sforno on this passage, which is in source number 4 that you have in front of you. He writes, it's a very short commentary. He says, what was this vision that they saw? He says, Etzem ne'edar kol hatzurot hasichliot umuchan lekablam. This was a substance, says Sforno, very much like the Rambam, which is divested of all form, and is intellectual form that comes from the intellect, and is therefore ready for receiving all manner of form to be imbued within it, exactly as the Rambam explained to us in these last few lines. Kemo hasapir halavan hane'edar mikol hamarot, just like transparent sapphire, which is divested of any color. Okay, now, this is the punchline, okay? V'hu etzem hanefesh ha'enoshit hasichlit. This represents the human soul that is primed now to receive intellectual infusion, hane'ederet mikol mada, that is divested of all knowledge, umuchenet lekablam bi'iyun bichiri, but is now prepared to receive all intellectual infusion through man's free will, and through investigation that is a result of his free will, through his free-willed investigation, I guess you could translate it. The point is that the Sforno explains that what God was demonstrating to the Shivim Zikanim is that there is a new creation that is taking place at the time of Matan Torah. Just as creation was the infusion of divine form into formless matter, the giving of the Torah is the infusion of divine intellect into the formless soul of man. Man, at this point in the history of mankind, is divested of sophisticated intellect, and now man, especially the Jewish people who have been a slave class for the last hundreds of years, are now primed. They have become primed through becoming sort of this formless matter of humanity, through having been slaves for generations, are now ready to receive this divine intellect that is being infused into them through the giving of the Torah. And that is the essence of the message that Hashem needs to communicate to the elders of Israel. I have brought you through these series of events to bring you to the point where you are prime matter metaphorically, in that you have been completely divested of any kind of intellectual form of your own. You have no essential philosophy. You have no essential intellectual model of purpose, of meaning of life, and of deeper self-awareness. And all of this is now going to be imbued within you through the giving of the Torah, which is now going to imbue you with a completely new value system, intellectual way of thinking, a whole new, right? In other words, this is almost like a replication of creation, but on a microcosmic level within man, instead of the macrocosmic level of creation. And that's exactly why God is portraying that you, mankind, you, the Jewish people particularly, are now like this sapphire brick that are formless matter ready to be infused with the Torah. Now, I want you to sort of cogitate upon it for just a moment and take into account that this is a theme that is developed in many, many different ways and can go in many, many different directions. The Maharal, in his book called the Netzach Yisrael, which talks about the eternality of the Jewish people and the looking forward of the coming of the Messiah, mentions that this same theme can be explained when we talk about the vision that Zechariah has of the Messiah as Ani v'rochev al chamor, as a poor man riding in on a donkey. And the Gemara actually relates a very interesting interchange between the sage Shmuel and the Shvor Malka and the Persian ruler, a Gentile Persian ruler, who was mocking the sage Shmuel for this passage in Zechariah. You're telling me that your king, the Messiah, is going to come riding in on a donkey of all things, a beast of burden, a stupid, simple animal in the farm that is worth almost nothing. You're telling me that that's what your King Messiah is going to be riding on? Why don't you let me give your King Messiah one of my horses in my royal stable that is much more valuable and is much more fitting of a king? That's the way he was mocking Shmuel. And Shmuel said that if you were going to be providing me with a proper horse for the King Messiah, it would have to be a horse of a myriad colored horse, a multicolored horse. And that's the interchange. And the Maharal says, what is the deeper understanding of what is going on over here? He says, the reason why the Messiah rides in on a donkey is because the word chamor is very much related to chomer, which is the word for matter in Hebrew. And what it represents is that when the Messiah comes, he will be the herald of a new world order, where the world will now be in its moment of transformation, ready to be recreated. And just like the sapphire brickwork that God portrayed to the elders when they were on the precipice of a new chapter in the evolution of mankind, so too that's what Mashiach is representing. Just like under God's feet is the sapphire brick, under the legs of King Messiah, he's riding on a donkey, which is the ultimate sort of the most simple form of formless matter that you can find in our sphere of reality. And that's what he's riding in on. And if you wanted to try and represent how King Messiah is going to be transformative to the world, you would have to find a horse of multicolored horse that would representing ready to receive all the colors, or receiving all of the colors from the Mashiach, who will imbue it with all of the colors of the rainbow, because he's going to be transforming that which is formless into something which is completely newly structured, into something that man has never experienced before. Okay, and that's the theme that the Maharal points out. I'm going to just leave you with one more idea. And by the way, that passage of the Netzach Yisrael is in your handout as well, in section 3. And I just want to leave you with one last thing. Unfortunately, we don't have time for Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer today, but I just wanted to point out that in the word sapphire, Kemasei livnat hasapir, sapir is something that is that shoresh, samech peiresh, appears at the very beginning of Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation. We don't have time to go into the history of the book of creation, maybe another time, but it's cited by a number of commentaries. It is according to tradition, the oldest book that exists, written by Adam Harishon himself, passed to Avraham Avinu and passed to Rabbi Akiva. But essentially it describes how God created the universe. It is a sort of an instruction manual or a recipe book for how God created the universe. And these three letters, Samech Pei Reish, can be manipulated in a number of different ways. And it says, Barat Olamo Bishlosha Sfarim, that God created his world with these three Samech Pei Reishes, Sfar, Sefer, and Sipur, which relate to the idea of God taking inventory, God speaking, which is L'Saper, and God counting. And all of them relate to this idea of God bringing into existence from nothing, bringing something into existence. It is therefore no coincidence that the description of prime matter, which is the very primary substance that God created, uses the very same letters as Samech Pei Reish, Sapphire, Sapphire. It is therefore, this is where we begin to see some level of intersection between a rationalist view of a Maimonidean, Aristotelian philosophy describing the Torah, and a Kabbalistic worldview many times will intersect when they describe this act of creation. Not enough time to discuss it more. We'll develop this idea as time goes on, and we're out of time. So I'm going to wish you a great day, and we'll continue next week.